Hello and welcome to another episode of the IDS Podcast. And we have a fun one today, one that I'm looking forward to. As a photographer, I'm looking forward to learning a little bit more about color. And we are actually virtual today. So you are the first virtual recording of the season, but we do have two more coming up. So it's pretty exciting. But I want to introduce Andrea Magno from Benjamin Moore. And I think your official title is your Director of Color and Marketing. Is that correct?
Yep. Color marketing and design. Yep.
Okay, so I didn't want to mess that up. So tell me, what does that mean, Director of Color and Marketing? Let's start there and tell me what your role actually entails.
Yeah, well, my role really involves anything and everything that has to do with color and Benjamin Moore. So, that really spans a lot of different things, whether it's working with the team on developing new tools that help designers, that help consumers or contractors. It's developing content that we have on our social channels or our website. Researching color and color trends, obviously, is a big part of what we do. But, really anything that we're putting out into the world that has to do with color somehow, some way comes through our team, which is a lot of fun.
Cool. So how did you get into this? What's your background? And how did whatever your background is, which we'll start getting into, how did that translate into your current role here?
Yeah, I would say I have always been drawn to art and design and color. So it's really something, even thinking back to, being a little kid and, my parents would take me to show houses and model homes. And I was so inspired by, particularly interior design and, really always being very engaged in art. That really led me to major in art history and English actually in college. And then from there, I worked at Christie's Auction House, which was, an amazing experience and really kind of got me into that world of, fine antiques and whatnot. I had always wanted to study interior design specifically, so I went back to school to New York School of Interior Design, and that was a great experience. And then from there, worked for a designer in Manhattan. Being from New Jersey and commuting to New York is, it's a lot, and so then
it's a lot. Most of our listeners are Long Island based, so they know exactly what you're talking about.
They know what I mean. Awesome experience, but 3 hours a day commuting can kind of wear on you a bit. And a role came about at Benjamin Moore, which at the time I didn't even realize was based in New Jersey. And so it was really kind of like a perfect role to be able to work on color. And through many years, I've been in different roles, whether focused specifically on color or working with the architect and designer community, really moved through different positions to where I am today. And what's just been great about it is I've been able to kind of bring together, my past education and past experiences and just really kind of like love for color and design and build it into my role. So it's, I definitely am lucky in that.
Cool. Yeah, you mentioned earlier you have a lot of responsibilities at your position. So what does a typical day look like for you?
Well, I'd say no day is exactly the same, which is something that I love. It just, it's always, a different challenge. It's a different kind of project, really kind of thinking, about how we're going to tackle different things. But I would say that,
Well, I think that's the best part about being a creative almost is,
right.
People say to me like, don't you hate not having that security of just being comfortable where you are? And I'm like, no, I like being at a different place every day. I like doing something different every day. I don't know where I'm going to be. Like, I know what my schedule looks like for the next 3-4 weeks, but I don't know what I'm walking into when I walk into a production. So it's similar.
Yeah, no, it's definitely a similar kind of thing. And, some days it's focused on, different color materials. Other days it's talking a lot about, what's the photography that we're going to be doing? Where are we going to be shooting? What are the colors that we want to feature? What are some of the objectives of that? Reviewing different creative elements that we're going to be putting out there. So, I really love the variety, but I think one of the commonalities in it is we're always bringing the work back to, like, how are we going to help the customer? Is it a designer? Is it a homeowner? And how are we going to put things out into the world that are going to answer their questions and really position us as that resource when it comes to color and paint. That's going to be, helpful and help us be their go-to.
Cool. Let's transition, and we're going to talk about paints and trends and all that other stuff later. But I do think it's important to get a little theoretical and talk about, I guess, the psychology of color and how that relates. And I know that's the most part of this conversation that I'm interested in, just because I think a lot of that relates to photography as well and what the viewer sees when they're looking at a photograph. So let's talk a little bit about how color impacts perception and human behavior. And in that regard, how does color affect mood or perception of space or even behavior, as I said?
Yeah, I mean, color is so subjective. It's almost kind of, and maybe you kind of get into this a little bit as well. It's such a great thing, but it's also can be so challenging, right? Because we're
Yes.
all seeing color differently. We're gravitating towards different color differently. But it's such a key part in shaping, what is the mood of a room? How does the client want to feel in that space? And, all too often people are almost either too quick to say, either I'm going to rule this out, or they choose a color and they don't necessarily have that almost soul searching moment to think about, what is the color that they want to surround themselves with that's going to, just make them feel great in the space. Maybe you had a stressful day and you get home and you just want your home to be your, enclave away from the world. So what is the color that's going to help to enhance your mood and so forth? And there's even, the other side of it is the way that we perceive colors and how you can almost use that as a tool to enhance a room, right? If you're using warmer colors and it makes it feel a little bit more cocooning, or you're using lighter colors and it feels more light and airy, thinking about how the color is going to do so much to shape the experience when you're in the room. It's an important decision. And, it's something that I think can trip people up sometimes, but I think if you take it step by step, you can wind up with some really very successful results.
Yeah, I mean, do you have some examples? Because I mean, for instance, I have a tendency of seeing, because I photograph for interior designers, and seeing blues and grays in bedrooms and lighter colors in kitchens and stuff like that. So do you have examples of different rooms and what kind of palettes people kind of lean towards and how that affects their mood and how that's all related to each other?
I mean, typically, it's kind of, the rule of thumb where if you have colors that fall into, I'd say, nature's palette, blues, greens, those are the colors that I think always wind up being, the top of the most popular list, I'd say. And I think a lot of that, my personal opinion is that I think a lot of that has to do with the comfort level of people being around those colors. You go to the beach, you go for a walk in the woods. Those are the colors that we see all the time. And so it's almost like a subliminal association that people have with those colors that makes it feel really, welcoming. Whereas, some of the other colors, maybe, reds are a little bit more polarizing, right? So some people absolutely love them and the energy and really what that brings to the table, versus other people where it feels almost too intense. So, it's kind of going back to really evaluating, how the individual feels in the space. And so, and I'm sure, in your work too, you probably see a lot of the, blues and greens and neutrals as well. So, definitely.
Yeah, and it's funny because, you do see that, especially in residential, and then you go to commercial spaces, which I do a lot of as well, especially retail. Majority of my work is actually retail spaces, and you just see everything there and stuff that especially now with like all these different conceptual retail spaces coming out, it's like you see some of the craziest things that you would never imagine seeing, and it's working.
Yeah, yeah. Well, but if you think about it, like those are the spaces where people can be a little bit more adventurous. They can be a little bit more, crazy and creative. And you never know, maybe someone will walk into a retail space. I always think about hospitality in particular, where, maybe you do something that is a little bit unexpected, but maybe that's going to spark an idea for somebody to actually try in their home. I feel like dark colors are particularly popular right now. We're seeing a lot of people are using them I kind of feel like years ago, it was almost a little bit daunting to use darker colors. People felt like, oh, it's going to make the space feel too small. But now there are so many great examples. There's more of an appetite for it. And so, you start to see where, a color used in, say, a commercial application might have been a little bit like, whoa, they're really going out there. But little by little, it can trickle into residential.
Yeah. So how can designers use this then to sort of navigate their clients towards the right emotional color? And I guess, like you said, comfort level is a big part of it, but is that the biggest thing is just...
I think it's comfort and being able to visualize what the space is going to look like. Some people, I think, can visualize a space really easily, and maybe that's the role of the designer where they sort of have that vision, but maybe the client isn't there yet. So it's really kind of helping them along through, is it example pictures? Is it bringing them to a space where they can actually see the color in real life? Almost taking the time to ease people into, what it's going to feel like, what it's going to look like. That can really kind of help to create that level of comfort and maybe even help to push them into a color that they previously wouldn't have even considered.
Yeah. So I know this is a bad example, but I'm going to say it anyway. Two weeks ago, I was in the Crayola factory with my kids, and the one out of Pennsylvania. Yeah. And I was actually reading the history of crayons, and they talk about how in the 1800s, they literally released like 4 crayons, and then it was 8, and then over time, now they release packs of 64, and I think Crayola produces hundreds of different colors, the most obscene colors ever, but they do. And it's like, so how do different generations over time interpret color differently, especially when you compare what was probably 200 or 300 years ago, and people only thought of primary colors, even though obviously there are millions of different varieties of colors out there, to the way now where, I don't know how many colors you offer, but I would imagine it's dozens and dozens of different color options.
Oh yeah. Well, we have over 3,500, so it's kind of a lot.
Yeah.
So we definitely have a.
I have to investigate if you or Crayola have more color options available.
I don't know. That's actually a great question. But I think a lot of it has to do with its availability and its exposure. It's also past references. So, it was interesting. I was actually recently over in the UK, and they were talking about exterior paint colors. And so how what they're accustomed to is only having a small subset of colors that they could choose from. Mm-hmm. Whereas when they, look to our collections and all of the colors that you can get, it's kind of like, oh my God, like who knew I could get all of these colors? So I think a part of it is what you're used to, what what's just sort of your norm, and then kind of working from that point. But I think it's also like living through different time periods. You might say, oh, that color looks like it's so 80s, and maybe when you were growing up, your aunt had a carpet that was in a color that was like the quintessential 80s or 70s. You hear that a lot. Yeah. And so I think it's sort of where your point of references are. And I think right now, when we're bombarded with so many images and so many ideas and all of these different things, on social media and so forth, it really kind of, expands our thinking. And it's almost like, oh, I saw this amazing dress on the red carpet and I'm absolutely in love with that color. And then maybe that, sparks that color showing up in all of these different places. So,
Yeah, I wonder if there's like a subconscious, like natural affection towards colors, like generational colors. For instance, like the 80s, like you said, with maybe more out there neonish colors, or, the 90s. I was a teenager in the 90s with that like dark grunge rock type of like, darker. So it's like, I wonder, and I never really thought about it till you brought it up, if there's like this subconscious layer hidden somewhere underneath where you kind of gravitate towards those colors when maybe you were a teenager and kind of finding yourself.
Yeah. Or I even, heard a story about somebody who used this particular shade of blue in her home because it reminded her of a blue, like the blue cabinets in her grandmother's house. So it's like taking a positive color association from another point in your journey and saying like, oh, I really love that. And how color can make this indelible mark in our brains. It's really kind of wild.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting. There was an episode we did last season. I forgot what the context of the episode was with an interior designer out here, Christine Conte, and we started talking about a yellow kitchen, and I forgot the contents and the exact context, but she was saying how one of her clients insisted on a yellow kitchen because it brought her back to her childhood home or her grandparents' childhood home where they had a yellow kitchen growing up. And then when she was redoing her house, that's what she wanted to emulate is that kitchen growing up. So there's a sense of nostalgia there.
Yep. Yeah. Color memory.
Yeah, exactly. All right, let's talk about a little bit about choosing the right color, because I would imagine that's a daunting task. I know it was daunting for me when I painted my house, especially when you have 3,500 colors and so many of them are so similar to each other. So what are some challenges some homeowners might actually face when trying to choose the right color?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with the process of elimination and narrowing and really kind of focusing on, what are the color families that you want to focus on, so it's almost kind of like taking that moment to, have a point of inspiration, is there something that's in the home that you want to complement? Do you have, say, an area rug that, you're going to have this in the room. So, what are the colors in there that you want to really kind of highlight and maybe use as your paint color? So, looking at, say, our 3,500 colors, if you're able to focus on one color family, you've really knocked out a lot of colors just in one shot. And then it's a matter of kind of figuring out, do you want it to be darker? Do you want it to be lighter? And really kind of like, sort of that funnel. But then the other thing that is, sort of interesting about Benjamin Moore is that even though we have 3,500 colors, they're broken into different collections. So you may say, for a designer who's familiar with our offering, they may say, this house is going to be, perfect for the historical collection. And that's, one of our most popular. And then they can just go straight there. And then you have, 191 colors that you're working from. So it's not as overwhelming as saying, how am I going to pick one out of 3,500?
Well, 191 is still overwhelming. It's
not as bad as
not as bad. Yes.
But, and then within that, okay, then maybe there's, 10 blues, there's 10 greens, so it's a matter of, focusing. And then I think having some point of inspiration is a really, really good way to help focus the conversation, and it's not a matter of getting the exact perfect match or, being too matchy. It's, having that sort of, North Star that you're leaning, you're trying to get to, and, hopefully it's a color that makes you feel good in that space. So, really leaning into the way that we have our collections broken out is, a nice way to be able to kind of like break the process apart too.
No, that makes sense. So this question is going to get a little bit, I guess, a little theoretical, sort of like what we were talking about before, but how important is interior lighting? And I could speak on this for days from a photography standpoint, but how important is interior lighting in regards to affecting the color choices?
It's huge.
Out there?
Huge. That's probably one of the most important components. And, it kills me when people, stand in the store and they're looking at the little chip and it's like, yep, this one is fine. Like, no, please don't do that.
Yeah, exactly.
It's really so important to understand the way that color is going to look in your home, in your lighting, or the client's home in their specific lighting. And it's not even, it's almost in the project timeline, it's kind of building in, even if it's a day or two, to live with the color, because there are colors that are going to look one way in the morning, and say you have, south facing light or north facing light, it's going to change throughout the day. So, you want to be able to, make an informed choice and really understand the way that color is going to be impacted by, morning light, evening light, etc. And know if there's going to be a funny undertone coming through, or whatever the case may be. So I can't stress enough the importance of sampling and really looking at the way that light plays a role.
And sampling, just explain sampling just for people like myself who don't know and don't know anything about design.
So
in that regards.
We offer a number of different types of samples. So, instead of just relying on a, 1 inch by 2 inch strip chip from the display, we have half pint samples or wet paint samples that you can brush either on the wall, or you can put it on maybe a piece of foam core, so you can have a pretty big sample. You can move it around the room. We also, on our website, we sell peel and stick samples, so that can be, if somebody doesn't want to paint directly on the wall, we have those. So there are different, those are probably the two most popular ways to really test out the colors in your room.
I was about to say, is that the best way for designers to really, or what is the best way in that regard? Sampling, I guess, is part of it, but for designers to kind of express to their clients, like this paint color, will look different, like you said, throughout the day, will look different depending on what light fixture we choose, will look different if we put tungsten bulbs versus daylight bulbs and all that stuff. The light will look different all the time. And, it's funny, like that's the hardest thing for me when I'm photographing a space, is to try to match the colors, because an interior designer will say to me, hey, I need the colors to look exact. And I'll say, well, colors looking exact will look different all the time. So exact to what? So what's the best way for designers to kind of express to their clients, like, we have to make this educated decision, and it's not something you can walk into a store and look at swatches and make. This might be something that might take a week of us putting the work in to make sure it's the right color.
Yeah, well, we offer, for designers in particular, we do offer larger chips that they're able to order as well. So, usually I think, when you have that bigger chip and you're looking at it in the space, you're looking at it with the different fabrics, you're looking, just to see like how everything is complementing one another, and under the different lighting conditions, that's where you're going to be able to, really kind of validate that the color does work in the room, and we see, designers all the time. We have, 8-inch by 9-inch samples that they really like, and they'll put them on a mood board. They'll, have them sent to their client so that they can live with them a little bit, just to, help them feel more, confident about the direction that you're headed.
Yeah, it's so important. Like even with a plain white, for instance, which is white, when you're daytime and there's no lights on, then daytime and you put your lights on in the house, or there's so many different variations that happen throughout a day in a home that I think people don't even realize happens, that affect the color. Your white might look more yellow, whatever the case is, might look more blue if it's a gloomy day, whatever the case is. So yeah, I think it's just important, like you said, to just get that sample and just put it up there for as long as you can. Whites, and you
brought up whites there, that and neutrals, I would say, are almost sometimes harder than, a green, a blue, a violet, whatever. Those are the ones that they're more apt to have undertones that are going to really come through when you get into different lighting conditions. If you're in a north-facing room, you're going to have different undertones from that color really come through, just purely because of the color temperature of the light.
Yeah, especially also what's outside the room. And, I notice this the most, if I'm shooting a neutral space or a white room, and right outside that bedroom, there's a backyard with grass, we'll get some tones of green coming in, just because the way the light reflects, and those things, like I said, have to be considered because, we're talking about light and reflection and all that stuff. They play such an important factor.
Yeah.
And if there's a pool in the backyard, you'll start to see some blue come in. It's crazy.
Yeah, and I think people don't necessarily think about that. It's like, but I want this beautiful crisp white. Why is it looking green? Why is it looking blue? And it's really, there's kind of an education piece too, and I think for the designer, that's almost kind of like a great tool for them. They're the expert. They're able to really educate their client on, well, this is what's happening. Here's what we're going to do to really kind of, mitigate the green, or, maybe if there's a lot of green coming in, you use a white that has a little bit of a pinky kind of cast, and they're going to kind of balance each other out. So, there's the tricks of the trade, but it's also understanding, how the light, how the colors work together to be able to get to that desired end result.
Yeah. All right, let's talk a little bit about trends and what's happening with paint now. So you have the color of the year, always gets a lot of buzz, obviously. What's that selection process like? I mean, how is that? And obviously you don't have to give us the exact formula, but how is that made when the announcements come out?
Yeah, well, so, it's a very long process. We launch our color. We always launch in October. And I would say when we launch, we probably give ourselves maybe a 2-week breather, and then we're starting on the following year. Yeah. So, it is about a year-long process, and it's a lot of fun. It's something that we all really enjoy, because that's our opportunity to bring all of the different things that we've been seeing, all the, pictures, different things that we've collected in our travels. We bring all of that, each team member brings that together, and we start workshopping it, and we start talking about what are the colors that we're seeing, what are the, different influences just kind of, in society, what are people gravitating towards, bringing in different, I went to this exhibit and here was something that really stood out at me. And so it's this very collaborative, very open kind of process where we're, just putting anything and everything on the table and saying, okay, like what are the themes? And we start to kind of narrow down to say, okay, maybe, we're seeing colors that are more midtones, let's say, and that's something that's really popping out. And then it's just a matter of kind of like digging into some of these different themes and really kind of uncovering, okay, well, why are we seeing this? What are the exact colors that we're seeing? And then a really important point is bringing it back to paint, right? Because, there could be a color in, some other industry, say it's the auto industry, just, to make something up, maybe there's a particular color that's really interesting happening there, but maybe it does or doesn't translate to a good wall color. And so it's, how can we take some of these trending colors and then think about how it relates to the home environment and, how people are going to be able to live with that color? What are the things that have been out there? What is existing? How is it all kind of coming together so that, it can feel, attainable and people get it?
Cool. So what kind of trends are you seeing in general in colors now? Whether it's warmer tones, I know you mentioned earth tones always have that comfortable feeling just because people are outside all day, for the most part. So 2025, what are some trends that you're sort of seeing, especially now in the summer? I mean, is it seasonal? Do color trends change as the seasons progress, or it's mostly it's not as seasonal?
Well, for some industries, yes, you have a faster turn, but, looking at paint, it's definitely a slower evolution, I would say, from one year. Typically, it's a little bit slower from one year to the next. But for 2025, we put out our palette. For this year, we have a really nice mix of midtones. We have some paler colors. The kind of word that kept coming up as we were working through it, we felt that the colors were quietly colorful in that they weren't screaming, they weren't, like beating you over the head when you walked into the room, but they had a presence and a sophistication to them, particularly the more mid-tone colors where, they made a statement, but they were also flexible enough to work really well with, different fabrics and, different elements that were in the room.
Cool. How do you balance that, or how does a designer balance that? Or if you can speak to that, or have any advice for a designer where a client wants to go with something that's trendy and something that's trendy now in a popular color, but you want this to age appropriately. You don't want And obviously, paint colors. They say I don't know what the longevity or how often you're supposed to technically repaint your house, but you want something that even in 5 years is still gonna look pretty current and pretty trendy and not be aged significantly. So, how do designers kind of gear their clients towards finding that proper balance?
Well, I think that's actually one of the components that we really look at when we're putting together our trend palette, because, we know that people are not going to paint their room every single year. You are going to, it's a longer time span. And so, the colors that we put into the palette they're directional and they're reflective of the colors that we're seeing, in the different research that we do. But we also look to have a little bit of a timeless kind of quality to them, where they're not going to be that flash in the pan kind of thing. But it's also a matter of looking backwards too, to see, how the colors are evolving from one year to the next. So for instance, thinking about the neutrals, if we look at some of our trends palettes from a few years ago, some of the neutrals were a lot cooler. They were a lot more, on the, cooler gray side, let's just say, using that as an example. Now, what we've seen little by little is a shift into the warmer grays or, grayish type colors, and even into more beigey colors. So, I think it's a matter of, thinking about how the room is coming together and how you can, have flexibility and layering. So that way, even if you have whichever color, how is that reacting to the other elements, so that you can keep the room fresh for a number of years, and it doesn't feel like, well, I did this year and now next year it's out of style, So I think it's really kind of like a matter of looking at, what are the elements that are timeless and what are the elements that you can get away with doing something that is going to be a little bit more like, if I don't like this next year, I can change it out. Maybe it's a throw pillow, but it's really important, I think, for wall color to really, look at it in a little bit of a time horizon.
Yeah, no, it's interesting because we had an episode actually that released, that's releasing this coming week. And it was more about bathroom and fixtures and sustainability, actually. And the person I was interviewing was telling me how now a lot of the fixtures for bathrooms, for instance, they're being made where you can kind of just swap out the shower handles in 2 minutes and stuff like that as time progresses. But paint is one of those things you can't. It's not that easy. You can't. They're not made modular, if that makes any sense. Mm-hmm. Where if you kind of get sick of your faucet handles, you can just swap them out. But paint, you can't do that. I mean, you got to pull your furniture out. It's a process.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
It's important.
Processes, a countertop or tile.
No,
right?
yes, of course. But it's not a 20-minute thing where you can buy a new fixture online, and most likely, especially nowadays, because everything is so modular, fix it yourself.
Yeah.
It's a little bit more of a process. Last question I'm going to ask you about trends. I mean, is there things that you're surprised that are actually making a comeback? Things maybe that 10 years ago you were like, ugh, this has to go, and now you're seeing it pop back up? Or I know you mentioned nostalgic colors from the 80s, or maybe I mentioned it, who knows. But stuff like that, things that you're surprised are coming back into trend.
It's interesting when you kind of take a step back and you look at, call it 2008, right? You had a lot of the warmer colors, and
it's crazy that's almost 20 years ago, huh?
Right? It's sort of depressing. But, I remember back then it was kind of like the, sort of Tuscan influence and, a lot of these warmer colors. And then, you saw that sort of like fall out of favor, and everything was a lot more cool and, dare I say, a bit more austere. And then little by little, people kind of moving back into the warmer colors. So, really kind of looking at it, from, a macro view, just to see that sort of like ebb and flow of the way that the colors move. And, I think, we've been tracking the return to warmer colors for a number of years, and we do continue to see that. And even actually with our 2025 color of the year, cinnamon slate, it's a really interesting color in that it has a lot of violet to it, but it has some notes of brown, and it's a very velvety, beautiful, it's a beautiful color. But, one of the things that I did think about was, like, are people going to peg this as a mauve, or, like, is it going to, conjure those thoughts? But, it really hasn't, because it's a modern interpretation, and it has, just this depth and beauty to it. And the response from, designers, from homeowners, people have really fallen in love with this color. And I think a lot of that has to do with it feeling really enveloping, and it just really kind of, I don't know, it's this kind of magical color that just enhances a space. So, not falling into, decades or anything like that, and almost leaning into some of that nostalgia and, sort of, retro-y kinds of colors that have, these different sensibilities. And then it kind of begs the question, well, why are people looking for that? Is it that they're, looking for that comfort and almost that cocooning kind of feel in their home? So, there's so many facets to it. It's really, interesting to dig into.
Yeah, cool. Let's wrap up, as we're starting to run a little bit low on time, and talk about some tools and resources. And what kind of tools are you guys using at Benjamin Moore to help designers make more informed choices, or help their clients make more informed choices? Whether, you talked about, I guess, swatches and peel and stick and peel, whatever it was called. But what about digital tools? Is Benjamin Moore utilizing AI yet, and all that stuff, to try to help their clients make more informed decisions?
Yeah, so we have a number of, print materials, tangible tools, from the larger chips that you can order to the fan decks, that a lot of designers are quite familiar with. But we really, it's an interesting shift from, years ago to now, where there's a lot more digital tools available. So for instance, we have color detail pages, we call them, on our website, where each one of our colors has, this page that goes in depth with, the descriptions of it, different colors that are similar to it, suggested combinations. So that's a really nice resource for, for anybody to go to really kind of like take a deeper dive into a particular color. We also have an app, our Color Portfolio app, which is, it's a really great tool. It's kind of like having a digital fan deck, on your phone. And I know I refer to it all the time. There's even a visualizer tool on it. So, we have a number of tools in the digital space.
What is the visualizer? Is it like a augmented reality type thing, or is...
So you can take a picture of your space, and then you can, mask different areas and do just, a quick kind of idea of what a pink color would look like.
Yeah, that's essentially like augmented reality, where you can take a picture of something and say, "Oh, show me this wall in this color," basically.
Yep. Yeah, exactly. So,
and I think that's the best way to do it. It's obviously tougher with new builds, because those rooms or those walls are not there yet. But I would imagine even on renders, you can just put specific paint colors to the T right on into your renders and get an idea of how things are working. What about AI? Is Benjamin Moore using AI yet, or do you plan on trying to integrate different ways of using AI in the future to may not be your department, or I don't know if you're on the technical side of things, but
I'm definitely not on the technical side. But I think it's definitely something that we are going to be looking at, just because it can be a really interesting tool that can help people with that visualization process. We have some visualizer things on our website, but looking at the way that has really that continues to evolve and get better. And, there's a lot of possibility there.
Yeah. What's the best way? Is there, maybe I'm just kind of like thinking, hopefully out there, or being hopeful for like, because I just think everyone that's involved in the industry, regardless of what you do for the industry, should be collaborative, because it just makes the product much better, from paint colors to designers to even photographers who are capturing finished products. But do you feel like brands like Benjamin Moore should be more involved in the design process from the beginning, or it doesn't really affect? Because obviously everything plays into it, and I've heard from some designers the paint color is the first thing you want to decide on and then build around that, and I've heard the opposite things from other people, where you kind of let the client choose the furniture and the decorative pillows and all that stuff, and then the paint color is just an accent to that. So what are your thoughts on how the best way for designers and brands like Benjamin Moore, paint brands, to sort of collaborate and get the best product for their clients?
Well, I think I think some of it depends upon the individual designer's process, and when they bring paint into the equation. But I do think that, having that relationship with their Benjamin Moore rep. So, we have our architect and design reps and spec writing reps, and, we have a number of people out there who are on hand to be that resource to answer not only color questions, but it's also, what is the right product that's going to be the right choice for such and such situation, or, even leaning into them to understand more about, different effects you can get from sheens, or, all of that advice I think is really, really important as, a whole room is coming together. And it doesn't necessarily have to be a conversation that happens at the end. If you want to do something really interesting with, different sheens, or, there's an aesthetic element that paint is going to help bring to the table, bringing that in earlier can really help to inform the way that the whole room is going to take shape. So, really, really developing that relationship with the rep can be, extremely, extremely helpful, because they're honestly a wealth of knowledge.
Okay, so speaking of that, which is a perfect segue, I was going to ask you, what's the best way for designers to find or build that relationship with their local Benjamin Moore rep? And are they called reps or color consultants? Or,
yeah, no, our
I don't know.
architect and design reps.
Okay.
So on our website, we have a section that's devoted to architects and designers. And so if they go into that tab, they're able to put in their information and then, be contacted with their rep if they don't know them already. So, we have them, across the country. We have a great rep in Long Island, and,
Yes.
she'd be happy to help, anybody with, whether it's getting color tools or helping to choose the right product or troubleshoot or any of that.
Okay, cool. So I'm gonna end on one final note, because this is a question that I'm sure every designer struggles with. What is one piece of advice that you can give designers who are dealing with client indecision regarding color? Because I know everyone does. It has to happen. So.
Yeah, I think we kind of touched on it earlier, where it's really just helping them to visualize and giving them examples, and really kind of, walking them through, doing things to build up their comfort level. And, it's a lot of times it's that aha moment when they see examples of rooms that are in the vein of what they're trying to accomplish. Or the other thing too, sometimes when you're trying to get to a specific color, is comparing two colors. I find that can be a really great way to have that light bulb go off, particularly with neutrals, where, that's when you can really start to see the undertone and really understand the makeup of the color. So that's something that I've found has been really, really helpful with some of those conversations.
All right, cool. Well, I want to thank you for your time, Andrea. This was definitely an interesting conversation, especially for me, and the color psychology part of things is always very interesting for me. But I appreciate it, and this was quite a unique episode compared to the ones we normally deliver. So I appreciate you coming on. So it's been fun. So thanks again.
Good. Thank you so much.